and welcome back. So I'm sure you've seen the videos by now of the so-called largely peaceful BLM movements, which are now being called largely peaceful anti-racist movements, whereby you've had groups of BLM protesters, or whoever they are that wish to associate with them, chase down white people in order to attack them. We have several videos showcasing this, and of course, just to contrast that, I like to show why we should defund the BBC, or at least not have to pay for them if you have a television or any way of accessing the BBC, which includes an internet connection or a phone, that of course they demand that you pay them every year for this privilege of not having adverts on the BBC. And seeing as this is BBC News, it's worth mentioning it straight from the horse's mouth, given the full context that we know. So, we have their BLM supporter saying, "We stopped somebody from being killed," and what they go on to mention is that they saved a white man who was beaten down and then being attacked, and he would have died if it wasn't for them. And they say, groups including some far-right activists also congregated in the Capitol. So, wow, aren't these black people nice for saving this white man who was clearly racist? I mean, who was attacking him then? Oh, it was a group of the BLM protesters trying to beat a man to death. This seems like quite an important part of the story, BBC. Why wouldn't you want to mention this? If you're trying to be unbiased, open and honest, it might be quite important to point out why this man was attacked in the first place. Was it on the basis of race? Was it on the basis of trying to protect British culture? Was it on the basis of thinking that British heritage isn't something to be ashamed for, and instead, seeing as it is the country that is responsible for buying and then freeing so many slaves from Africa and outlawing it out there, which is where the slaves were bought from, that maybe there was something worth being proud of. And when it comes down to Winston Churchill and suggesting that, oh, he was such a bad man, well, just wait until they hear about the other guy. I can guarantee you he was considerably worse. In fact, some would say Winston Churchill would look like an amazing character next to the guy he was fighting against, and perhaps that's why he's been given a statue, because he was warding off the evil that is socialism. Socialism with German characteristics, if you will. Then yes, of course he was, but naturally the BBC aren't going to report this. And the BBC are actually a very good example of how to show things to just support your own narrative. So of course they're not going to report all the facts. That would take far too long and be far too informative, of course. Instead, they're going to find any sources, or at the very least any people just on the streets that would say the kind of things they want to say, and in doing so they can then use quotation marks in their titles and their articles in order to suggest that it is actually true, when in fact they're just quoting some stranger off the streets. But of course, by using the quotation marks, that they suggest that they're doing the right thing. So, for example, here, the Black Lives Matter supporter, and then quotation marks, "We stopped somebody from being killed." Seems like, wow, they're an amazing person. They saved somebody from being killed. This was probably some of those far-right thugs trying to kill one of their black people, wasn't it? But no, on the contrary, it was actually somebody who was part of these Black Lives Matter supporters, apparently, who was rescuing a white guy from being beaten to death by the Black Lives Matter communists. And that is what they are. They're cultural Marxist, feminist communists. At this point, they're looking to apparently defund the police, but they wish to replace it with their own police force. They're looking to basically increase the tax to 100% in order to reallocate it from some people to other people, and they're doing it on the basis of race. That is their idea of Marxism, essentially. And one of the most disparaging things, unfortunately, from this was, of course, the Prime Minister's response as he continues to dig himself into the hole, saying that there is much more that we need to do to tackle racism. Well, unless you're talking about anti-white racism, I think you've pretty much done it. At this point, there aren't any rights that white people have that black people don't have. On the contrary, black people have more, as you mentioned before. But nonetheless, as he was writing in the Telegraph, his main thrust of the argument is far-right people are bad, and we can't get rid of statues because that's British history and we've got to remember them. So as he's saying, he's also condemned the far-right thugs involved in the protests, and this is the equivalent basically of Trump saying that there were good people on both sides, there were bad people on both sides, and of course he condemns the white supremacists and the Nazis wholeheartedly, just like he does with the communists and the socialists wholeheartedly. But I repeat myself that it seems to be a similar thing here, in which case, of course, speaking out about far right is going to be thrown down the memory hole for all the media outlets to try to report on later, suggesting that it was just the far left that were doing bad things, as largely true as that might be. So he said their mission was utterly absurd, but he added that it was deplorable that Sir Winston Churchill's statue had been in danger of an attack. It comes after the statue in Parliament Square was spray painted with the words "was a racist" last weekend, as well as other signs which were thankfully taken down by a good citizen. In Bristol, racist protesters pulled down a statue of the creator of Bristol, Edward Colston. Yes, we can all editorialise. Bloody good job, BBC. Oh, you're so unbiased. Oh, just including the important facts, aren't you? Not going to call him a philanthropist, even though he set up Bristol. Good job. Anti-racism protesters always talking about race and how black people need supremacy. That's so accurate, BBC. Bloody good job. And, of course, Boris Johnson was disappointing in the entire thing, saying there is much more that we need to do, and we will. It is time for a cross-governmental commission to look at all aspects of inequality in employment and health outcomes in academic and all other walks of life. So also bringing in that, of course, from the coronavirus, the black people have died more, quite possibly due to poor life choices, including resulting in heart disease and diabetes. Let's not bring in heart disease of black people dying, otherwise you're going to have George Floyd come to the top again. Ooh dear. But, of course, as with anything in the government, it's always, I've got to be seen to virtue signal, and therefore I'll set up this committee and this management team and just go through all those jumps and hoops in order to appease the people, because everybody understands that anything in government takes a long time. Unless there's something worth doing, then it'll actually be done quickly. An emergency act, as they say. But yes, these things will, of course, take a long time. So I think they're just trying to push it off in order to not have to worry about it. And then when the result comes out, they don't have to acknowledge it. But unfortunately, the people that they will hire for this are people who will find anti-white racism everywhere. That is to say that they will, of course, hate the white indigenous folk and find any aspect that they can of anybody who isn't white British to of course be discriminated against, and therefore we've got to do everything in order to repatriate the money from the rich to the poor, that is to say from the white to the black. Rich to poor doesn't actually matter, because they're not doing it along class lines, they're doing it along race lines. And for whatever bloody reason, the so-called Conservative Prime Minister seems to be agreeing with them, suggesting that you've got to launch this cross-governmental commission. But, as he says in conclusion, let's fight racism, but leave our heritage broadly in peace. If we really want to change it, there are democratic means available in this country. Thanks, by the way, to Winston Churchill. Which is, yes, definitely correct. So, essentially, yes, fight racism, of course. I don't see anybody arguing against that. That is definitely a fair point. However, as I am perhaps a bit more of a radical then, if you will, that I'm all for private business to accept or not accept anybody that they wish. They have their free rights as far as I'm concerned. So if they wish to be racist and not accept people based on the colour of the skin, then they can do so. If they wish to be sexist, then they can do so. If they wish to discriminate based on appearance or height or muscle or clothes, then yes, they can do so. Because if that then creates a group which can be comfortable within themselves because they're more homogenous and therefore they feel better among each other, then so be it. And of course, if the business then gets a bad rap for being exclusionary, and isn't prestigious, but instead it's just exclusionary, then of course they'll have to shut down before too long. So I'm completely fine with that, and I think that would definitely reflect the cultural zeitgeist as well. I understand that the argument against it is to say, well, hey, you've got to allow other people to be able to live, and I certainly do. I just don't think you should be forced to associate with somebody, or forced to not associate with somebody that you want to or you don't want to, depending on where your alliances fall. I would say that is more of a civil rights violation than it is a right. But anyway, as always, leave your comments down below. Always intrigued to read what you guys have to say. And until next time, have a good one.